Hello and welcome to this first presentation on business continuity planning put together by the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire Growth Hub. I want this to be a bit of an overview on business continuity planning. As you can imagine, as a science, business continuity planning and all the associated concepts such as risk management is quite a breadthy topic, and ultimately the goal of this particular presentation will be to give you that grounding of principles which you can actually go about implementing when it comes to exploring the specific risks associated with business continuity planning. So anyone who's familiar with project management or risk management should find some kind of commonality with the features and concepts explored in this presentation. But ultimately, what the intention of this presentation is to give you that grounding where we can actually specifically explore all of these topics on the screen here. So as you can imagine, being in business, there are quite a lot of external and internal risks that play on your business's operations or your finances or the specific functions of your business. And it's going to be a lot easier to bring in specific experts in these areas and explore these specific topics with a prior foundation in the general concept of business continuity planning. So that's ultimately what we're going to be doing in this presentation. Now, like I said, this is not going to be an exhaustive resource on business continuity planning or risk management. It's just there to give you a bit of an introduction into the science, and then hopefully that should be enough to provide that foundation. You can explore specific areas. If you want to explore other areas, then feel free to reach out to the Business Resilience team or the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire Growth Hub, and we can have a much more kind of in-depth one-on-one exploration with your company. But ultimately, this resource is just here to give an introduction. So just to run right into it, business continuity planning basically starts by looking at your business as a series of functions. As we've got this diagram here, which is adapted from the ISO 22301, which deals with business continuity planning, we can see that there are various functions within the business. We have our main functions in sales, operations, installation and service. So these are kind of the core activities that deliver directly to the customer. And then we have our support functions. So these are things like human resources, IT, finance, the usual things that kind of feed into those primary processes on the top here. Nevertheless, business continuity planning goes under the premise that there may be a disruption event. That is to say, something that occurs that ultimately acts upon these particular functions. This can be anything from a cybersecurity attack, it could be a pandemic, for example, or it could be something like inflation, something that breaks the norm within the company and ultimately forces the business to kind of adapt its processes slightly. Business continuity planning, as a result, identifies what this disruption event is and then provides a plan of action on how the company can continue despite this disruption event. So ultimately, it's continuing business despite a disruption, whatever that disruption might be. The importance of business continuity planning, the importance of which has kind of grown in recent years, comes from a few areas. So probably the most obvious one is insurance. A lot of insurance policies will actually specify that a company will need to have a business continuity and plan prior to actually taking out the policy, or in some cases, the policy won't actually pay out if it turned out there was no business continuity plan. In funding terms, whether they're private funding, such as with a bank loan, or whether they're public sector funding like grants and such, there is normally a business continuity planning requirement within the terms and conditions of that funding. Works and contracts, again, mostly within kind of public sector. So if you're bidding on government contracts or any contract with a public sector body, there will normally be a business continuity plan requirement as far as operations are concerned. Obviously, the authority that's entering into a contract with you will want to know that if something happens to your kind of main operations or anything internal to the business, that they're going to get the products or services that they've paid for. And also, it's good from a general health perspective. If you're a business owner or an executive within the company, you spend a lot of time ensuring that things tick over like clockwork. So having a business continuity plan allows you to kind of plan for those unexpected items, or those items that otherwise don't occur frequently but could have an impact on the business. So now we'll go into some specific kind of risk management factors. And generally, the first port of call within a business continuity plan is to identify the risk or qualify it. And we can segment risks into two areas, external and internal. And we'll start with external first, because these are generally the factors that you can't control. They occur in the macro environment. And anyone who is familiar with a pestle analysis will know that, generally speaking, the kinds of risks that occur on the macro level, the external environment, can quite comfortably be segmented into these specific areas. But in recent years, we can actually add two more areas to this. So in other words, our pestle analysis will become our pest leaf analysis. And those two additional factors are epidemiological and foreign. So epidemiological, that's anything to do with public health. So we're just kind of coming out of COVID, touch wood, but that caused massive kinds of disruptions to businesses of all kind of sectors. Some fared better than others, but generally speaking, all businesses were affected, particularly those within the kind of hospitality and retail sectors, those that rely on kind of the social elements and face-to-face elements. They were very heavily hit by lockdowns and people not being able to purchase in a way that they could pre-COVID. Foreign as well. So not just in the sense of invasion, which might be a more prevalent risk if you have operations in countries that are a bit more unstable, but also things like cyber attacks. You know, increasingly SMEs especially have become very much a victim of cyber attacks and fraud kind of attacks, many of which are perpetrated by foreign actors. I think one of the more visual examples is within the NHS, when ransomware prevented the kind of general operations and IT systems within the NHS. Ultimately, that's what we mean by foreign, because it's not just about invasion. And all these factors come together to make up the macro environment of risks. So again, these are generally the things that we can't control. We can't control an economic crash, for instance. We can't control a public health concern. We can't control threats perpetrated by foreign actors. So generally speaking, these are the kinds of events that occur and have an impact on our business, irrespective of how well we plan for them in simple terms. A good way of kind of focusing the kind of external qualifying risk aspect of building your business continuity plan is actually to go on the kind of local risk register. So if you're a Staffordshire-based business, many of whom you are, you can go on to the Staffordshire Prepared's website and find the Staffordshire Community Risk Register. And it's a very useful resource that kind of qualifies the most pressing risks on a macro level. And it even has a rating as to which are more likely to occur and what that kind of impact is on a business. So it's a very useful resource to use. In fact, the beginning slide, which goes through the risks we'll be covering, was generally derived from this risk register. Now we'll move on to qualifying internal risks. Now, calling these risks is maybe a bit too, is not necessarily a good description, but these are functions within the business that you yourself have control over. And if you have control over them, and if they are systems, then they can be susceptible to kind of disruptions. But generally speaking, these are the functions within the business that ultimately you'll want to control as much as possible. And what the external factors, those present in the pest leaf kind of act upon. So that first one is generally management. So for instance, if you're bringing on executives, if you're bringing on middle managers, they have a substantial level of responsibility and accountability within your business. Therefore, they as human beings can be susceptible to risks, and that risk can spiral into your company. For example, if a manager is not particularly competent, or maybe the management has possibly lied on their CV, so they're not as qualified as they appear to be, that is necessarily a risk that can occur. The same can apply for employees. If an employee is not as competent as they are first believed to be in the interview process, or maybe there's a momentary lapse of health and safety, for example, that can cause risk to other employees and also the wider premises and equipment within the company. Premises, so obviously if you've got one premises for production and something happens to that premises, whether that's by virtue of something occurring internally or whether that's something occurring externally, like a weather disaster, for instance, any damage to that premises can cause a risk on the operations, the finances, and ultimately the fulfilling of customer services. Customers can also create a risk. If you're operating within the finance sector, for instance, and you take on investments or are the custodian of other people's money, there's a massive kind of regulatory requirement on you to ensure that that money hasn't come as a result of crime or terrorism. It's actually illegal to not be suspicious. So if it turned out that you took money from a criminal outfit, for instance, within the scope of onboarding your customers, then that can cause a regulatory risk on the business. Suppliers, particularly around solvency. So if you rely on your suppliers for inputs and it turns out that the supplier then becomes kind of insolvent, then that can obviously put a pressure on your own production and your supply chains. Business partners, so this is a similar vein to investors and employees. So working with specific people, if those people are PEPs, for example, politically exposed persons, then that can create some kind of pressure on the business. An obvious one, systems and processes. So anything to do with kind of fulfillment operations and manufacturing. If something goes wrong with equipment or if equipment gets damaged, then obviously that can cause problems from a business level. Companies' finances. So if you are not adequately capitalized, for instance, or if you don't manage debt correctly, then that can cause pressures and risks on the business. And a similar vein, cash flow. If you don't have enough kind of cash within the business at any given time, that too can put strain on the business and ensuring things like operations and fulfillment gets completed. IT systems, so an obvious one that we mentioned earlier, they can be susceptible to cyber attacks, for instance, or they can be susceptible to kind of locking down the business if they're not functioning correctly. I think it's safe to assume that most businesses kind of heavily rely on IT these days. So if anything happens to those systems, then that can cause pressures on the business. Things like equipment. So if you're in the construction industry and equipment doesn't function correctly or gets stolen or isn't adequately protected, then that can cause holdups and that can cause a risk on the business as well. Legal and compliance, so if you don't comply with either the regulatory or contractual obligations placed on you, that too can cause risks. And then logistics. We live in a globalized society now. Even if you don't explicitly have exposure to the international markets, if, for example, you're a very small SME or a micro business and you kind of deal in the local marketplaces, you still have kind of exposure to the global economy, and that in itself can create risks. And one of the more pressing ones is those around logistics. So once we've kind of qualified those risks, and I'll just kind of conclude by bringing it all together using our diagram before, we have our general processes, then we have our support functions, and generally those support functions flow in from the factors that we've just explored. And the risks generally come from the pest factors. So, for example, economic pressures can play on all of these functions within the business, the management, the employees, customers, etc., and they too feed in to the support and then the general process levels. The same can also be said for the epidemiological risks. They are macro, they can't be controlled, but they have an impact on those internal factors that we explored at all levels, and they feed through the support functions and then the main processes at the top. So it's quite important to qualify risks at the initial stage, and I would generally recommend that you qualify them on the macro level. So that's this pest leaf factor these pest leaf factors at the bottom. What those factors or what those risks have an impact on in terms of your internal factors, and then how that feeds through on terms of your HR department, your IT department, your finance department, etc., and ultimately how that impacts on your operations and your ability to deliver your services and ensure sales kind of come through the company. Once we've qualified our risk, we can then begin quantifying them. And we can use a very simple tool for this. And again, those familiar with risk management will be familiar with this already, but we can use a impact matrix. And generally on the x-axis, we will plot scores. So normally 1 to 5, that's the norm, but it can be any kind of range of numbers. On the y-axis, we have our likelihood. So the ability or the likelihood of something occurring. And the product of the two numbers will be our impact. And obviously, the higher the number, the higher the impact. And we can segment that according to low, medium, high, and very high. And it would generally make more sense to focus on the very high and high risks. You could argue that those with an impact score in the low region is probably not really worth implementing any specific system. It's certainly probably not worth kind of costing or attaching cost to that. Nevertheless, it's always good to identify just to have a clean bill of health. Once we've qualified our risks and quantified them, we can actually use something called a risk register to begin the first stage of our planning. And I'll just go into a risk register that I created earlier. Very simple, not particularly attractive. You can probably create your own or find a more fancier version online, but ultimately it serves the same purpose. So what we would do, once we've identified a risk, we would put that here. We would attach a risk owner. So this is someone who's generally responsible for that risk. It can be a department head or a specific risk manager or anyone within the organization. The risk trigger, so this is quite important. This is the event that would trigger this particular risk from occurring. So this would be specific to your business. Generally speaking, this would be identified during the qualifying stage of your business continuity planning. But generally speaking, this is the event that triggers this particular risk. Risk category, so if you wanted to categorize them according to the internal function or maybe the macro environment risk, that's completely up to you. But generally speaking, you might want to categorize the risk and then attach a risk owner to a specific category. Then we have our quantified fields, so our likelihood, our severity, and the product of those two numbers will be the impact. And then we can even kind of put at the very top of this risk register those impact scores that are in the high to very high region, so that we have a more kind of focused business continuity plan. Now we get into the more qualified areas, so the prevention plan. So if this event, or how do we prevent this event from occurring? How do we prevent this risk trigger from being triggered, the event from occurring? After we've done that, we might want to identify a reaction plan. So this is when we move away from risk management and go into crisis management. If our prevention plan doesn't work, what can we do as a result from a reactionary perspective to limit that impact? And now we want to identify whether it's been tested. Most plans are not particularly useful unless we've stress tested them. And we're going to get into that into some more detail down the line. But ultimately, this is a very basic risk register. You get the format. Ultimately, you understand what these specific fields are. And, this would be the foundation or the first tangible step in terms of bringing your business continuity plan to life. So once we have this, we are basically done at this point. We've got our business continuity plan, but now we need to write that into an actual kind of worded document. So some basic tips for that. Start by exploring the macro factors. Like I said, these are going to be where the risks originate from. It's going to be factors external to the organization, which ultimately act upon the internal functions, and that's generally going to be where the risk occurs. We can't control these pestilent factors, but we can control the reaction we get on those internal factors explored. Next, separate the plan into specific sections. So I would generally recommend the internal factors. So once you've explored all of the macro risks that are prevalent to your organization, including the exploring the community risk register, we can then separate the plan according to the specific areas of the business. Be clear to the point and be trigger response orientated. So identify what that trigger event is and then what happens after that point. What are you going to do to prevent that? And what are you going to do from a crisis management perspective if we can't avoid that event from occurring? Again, state how you intend to avoid that trigger, what we've already explored. And have testing dates. So test your plan, test the specific departments, test the accountability of the risk owners, test all of the plans that you kind of put in place. Otherwise, it's pretty much next to useless. You want to actually see under kind of test conditions or simulated conditions whether your business continuity plan holds up. So mention key staff, so these would be the risk owners, but also the job roles within the organization responsible for avoiding that particular risk or mitigating the risk if it should occur. And then set update dates. So this would be when you continually stress test your business continuity plan to ensure that it's fit for purpose. Otherwise, there's no real value in creating a business continuity plan today and then, keeping it there for 20 years because the factors and the scenarios might have completely changed to the point where the original business continuity plan is next to useless. So set clear update dates when you kind of constantly test them and how you change them. And again, there are some resources on the Staffordshire Prepared website attached to the Civil Contingencies Unit. So now we'll move on to actually testing the plan. Like I said, a plan is next to useless if we don't actually test it. And there are several ways we can do this. So first of all, there's the checklist approach, which is simply we go through the plan and we tick what criteria that plan satisfies in terms of mitigating a given risk. So it's very kind of bureaucratic. It's very kind of checklist orientated. We could do something called a desktop scenario, which is essentially when we take that checklist and we model that in a digital environment and test the business continuity plan. Or we can have an on-site simulation, which is probably by far the most useful in terms of determining whether the business continuity plan is fit for purpose. So that would be when we actually have a risk occur and we test that particular department and the business's resilience under those scenarios. So this could be anything from price changes to extreme weather events, to something happening at our premises, to cybersecurity attacks, any kind of event that we've identified as being particularly pressing on the organization, we can write that into our on-site simulation. So how might that look? So we'll go back to our trusted diagram, the one that we introduced at the very beginning. From a checklist approach, what would happen is if a disruption event occurs, let's assume a cyber attack, and the most obvious victim within the organization for that is going to be the IT department. We're going to see if this occurs, what does our business continuity plan state we should do? So in other words, what will John do under the circumstances of a cyber attack occurring on our organization? And then how do we ensure that our services, that our kind of front-facing customer and fulfillment services continue? Like we said, a business continuity plan is ensuring how our business continues despite a disruption event, whatever that event might be. The simulation approach is a bit more kind of reactionary. It's a bit more on the ground. So it's more when this event occurs, what will John do, or how will John do this, according to the business continuity plan. And in this scenario, does our kind of front-facing fulfillment and service continue? So it's a bit more proactive and a bit more kind of concrete, as opposed to the what ifs of the checklist approach. And we might want to factor into that how other departments, how our IT department kind of supports those other crucial departments such as finance, customer support and purchasing. If this event occurs, how does the IT department ensure that it's able to service finance, service customer support, service purchasing, and ultimately service our services of the business to ensure that we're delivering to our customers? And of course, in terms of testing our plan, we want to review the results and set our KPIs. So once we've tested them, we can see, for instance, what our response time is, if that was a KPI that we're dealing with. And then with that result, we can analyze them and see what room for improvement there might be, and then how we can write that into our business continuity plan. Once we've tested it, our business continuity plan shouldn't really stay the same. It should be amended to take into account the results of our tests. And then we can constantly use those KPIs to benchmark moving forward. So at our subsequent testing dates, So with that in mind, that pretty much covers business continuity planning from an overarching science. That should give you a very in-depth exploration of what business continuity planning is. And with that, we can actually go into exploring specific risks. And again, we can identify those risks that are external to the organization, as well as those that are internal. So the external or macro, they can be things like public health. So whether that's another COVID case, or whether that's another kind of viral outbreak or pandemic, anything that kind of acts negatively on public health and causes something like a lockdown, for instance. So infrastructure, so things like roads being damaged, or national grid being down. What are those specific risks? Weather and climate change, so that's becoming more prevalent in recent years. We've all seen the kind of dramatic flooding that were happening in Europe, the kind of wildfires that have been occurring, the droughts. That's all a result of climate change. And yeah, these might be in different places to the world, but like I said, we live in a very globalized society where the events 3, 4, 5,000 miles away actually have an impact locally. And then things like civil unrest. So what would happen if there is a kind of civil unrest situation in a global or local or national scenario? From an internal function perspective, cybersecurity, so that's a massive one. Like I said, as a business community, we're very much reliant on IT. So cyber attacks have so our IT systems and businesses are particularly sensitive to these kinds of risks. Customer due diligence, so working with the right people. How do we ensure that our investors are not criminals, or that we're handling the proceeds of crime, or that our kind of business partners are trustworthy? So what is that kind of process for avoiding fraud and ensuring we're working with the right people? Supply chain risk, Brexit. So Brexit's kind of a kind of catch-all with this, because it has a supply chain impact on all businesses. Now we're out of the European community. From the EU's perspective, things have changed. If we want to trade with the EU, if we want to take in items from the EU, we have to do different activities. We need a customs declaration. There's different regimes for VAT. There's different audit requirements. There's increased costs as far as logistics and processing is concerned. So how can we mitigate those kinds of logistical issues? And then there's the financial and working capital. So things like whether our business has enough working capital to manage day to day, or whether our business is sufficiently capitalized in case we go through another lockdown scenario and we need to survive and weather that particular storm. And that just about wraps up our presentation, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed that. Additional resources can be available, all things from general kind of external environment risks to things like mitigating fraud or cybersecurity kind of risks. And of course, there's the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire Growth Hub, as well as the Staffordshire Chambers of Commerce, which provides resources, as well as the business resilience team within the Staffordshire County Council. And that just about wraps up. So thank you very much for spending some time with me today. Like I said, as we move forward, we'll be exploring those specific risks explored in this particular presentation. But now when we do so, you'll have a bit more of an idea as to how we can write those risks into your own business continuity plan. So thank you very much.